I am here.
Excellent.
Hello.
Hi. Hi.
Hi.
Okay, so yeah, let's start with the next session. So next speaker is Justin Bruner from the University of Arizona. His areas of interest include philosophy of science, social and political philosophy, and social and formal epistemology. He's also particularly working with game theoretic models like the signaling game, stack hunt games, and Nash demand games to, among other things, study the emergence of conventions and norms. And his talk today has a title, Social Norms and Epistemology. So the floor is yours.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So there was a last minute change, and I will be talking about something a little different, but hopefully it'll be of interest to the audience. So not exactly on game theory, but an adjacent area on collective decision making. Okay, sorry, let me just get everything set up. Okay, yeah, so thanks very much for inviting me, and thanks for the organizers from HALA for putting this together. Not just these 2 days, but it sounds like there are many exciting conferences scheduled for 2021. So it's something to look forward to for the next year at least. So yeah, as I said, I'm going to shift gears a little bit. I'm not going to be talking or focusing really much on game theory per se, even though as Roland pointed out, game theory is one of my major areas of research. Instead, I'm going to wander a little bit into a related area and focus on collective decision making. So the scenarios I'm going to discuss are going to be very familiar ones. So we often have to decide as a group where to go to lunch. We might have to decide as an academic department, a bit more weighty of a decision, what courses to offer next year, who to hire. As a city or a state or a nation, we have to decide, collectively determine what policies to adopt, or at the very least, select officials to sit in the seat of power and make those decisions. And there are, of course, a bunch of different ways of making these collective decisions. So one flat-footed way, we could flip a coin. So if you and I don't agree on a restaurant, we can just appeal to a coin flip. More sensibly, though, we could vote on the matter. And there is, as many of you, I'm sure know, a really rich literature on voting methods that goes back to the 1940s, 1950s. And within this literature, there's this ongoing discussion and debate as to which voting method is best or most sensible. And I'm going to try and weigh in a tiny bit on this discussion. And ultimately, I'm going to suggest a new way to perhaps approach this sort of very question. Okay, so what do we mean by a voting method exactly? Well, I'm going to, throughout the talk, try and keep things as simple as possible, or I should say rid of technical details, and keep technical details to a minimum, and try to illustrate concepts sort of visually. So all we mean by a voting method is a procedure that takes as input a preference profile and identifies a winning candidate or social alternative. So on the left, I think that's, are we all seeing the figure in the same way? On the left, we should have a preference profile. And we have our 6 individuals, the voters, and there are 3 candidates or social alternatives that they're considering, X, Y, and W. And then the individuals each report their preference ordering. And then on the basis of this preference profile, the method selects Y as the winner of the election. Okay, so I want to emphasize that the voting method and voting methods generally just consider the way voters rank alternatives. So in other words, the only information that we have about individual voters are their ordinal preferences. Right? So that said, there are a whole host of different voting methods that we could appeal to. And as I mentioned earlier, there's been a lot written on this topic. A lot of ink has been spilled trying to determine which ordinal voting method is sort of most attractive or desirable. Okay, so this is how voting is typically conceived of. Collective decision making is often conceived in this way as well. And we have very little information about the voter. Now we can think, though, that this is just sort of one end of this sort of spectrum or continuum. And on the other end of the spectrum, we can imagine that we know each individual's cardinal utility function. And moreover, we can meaningfully make interpersonal utility comparisons, right? So we can compare utility across individuals. So these are two extremes that I'm now sort of juxtaposing. And with this wealth of information that we have on the right, a number of new procedures now become available to us, right? So we can determine taxation policy not just on the basis of a vote, but through some kind of utilitarian calculus. Or we can instead appeal to, say, the difference principle or a prioritarian approach if we want, right? Sort of et cetera, et cetera. There are lots of different avenues. And so what I'm going to do in the talk, so now we finally get to me saying what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the time, is I'm going to consider a situation where we don't have access to all of that helpful and nice information on the right. And I think this is a situation that we're typically confronted in the real world. So in the real world, we're often stuck with ordinal preferences, especially when it comes to large decision-making bodies. And then we have to determine which voting method do we then use to combine our ordinal preferences. And the question becomes what voting method is sort of best. And so to answer this question, I'm going to ask which method would be best if we actually had access to the richer utility functions, and we can compare utilities across individuals. So in other words, if we had all the information at our disposal, which method on the left, which only takes into account ordinal preferences, would, say, a utilitarian find most appealing? Which method on the left would a Rawlsian prefer? Which method on the left would, say, a prioritarian find attractive? And what I'm going to argue is that I'm going to draw on some real world survey data, as well as some simulations, is that the utilitarian, the prioritarian, and the egalitarian are actually all going to find one ordinal voting method particularly compelling, and that is the so-called Borda count, which if you're not familiar with, I'll get to in due time. Right. So that's the idea of the talk in a nutshell. So as we know, in the real world, for a variety of reasons, right, we only have access to ordinal preferences, and we're going to explore which method would be best if instead we had a much richer set of information to draw on. And then we find that there's broad agreement on the Borda count among those working within the sort of larger welfarist ethical framework. Okay, so just a quick roadmap before we really get into it. So before the meat of the talk, I'm going to go through a bit of background on voting. And then in the second module, take a quick look at welfarism and the various schools therein that we're going to consider. And finally, the main result, which involves an analysis of 4 decades of survey data, not collected by me, obviously, collected by other political scientists. And the data indicates that the Borda count is actually the most attractive voting method. Okay, great. So deciding how to decide. So there's this ongoing discussion that I've sort of been gesturing at in the literature, where people are comparing various voting methods. And the aim of at least some in this literature is to identify a special or privileged voting method. Right? So a voting method that is sort of head and shoulders above the rest. And for the most part, people have not had success in this endeavor, right? Or at least they haven't been able to convince their opponent, right, that their method is better. So one approach that we could take to trying to identify a privileged voting method is to appeal to what's often referred to as the ideal of political equality. And very roughly, right, when we think about political equality, what we have in mind is equal influence in the decision-making process. And that actually doesn't get us very far because most sensible voting methods respect the ideal of political equality. No individual voter is in a privileged position, at least in a lot of voting methods. And so the common approach that is taken by social choice theorists and by economists and political scientists who study these sorts of things is to enumerate a number of sensible conditions that we want a voting method to satisfy, and then go off and look for some method that checks all the boxes, so to speak. Now, of course, Arrow's impossibility theorem is in some sense a hurdle here. And so one takeaway is that each voting method or every voting method is going to come up short in some respect, right? It's not going to be across the board sort of a slam dunk. And then if no mechanism satisfies all of these sensible conditions, then we have to show, then we have to somehow weigh the importance of the different conditions. Right? And social choice theorists, people who study voting, don't agree on the importance of these conditions, and thus we don't have agreement on which voting rules are best. Right? And so the way I see it, at least, it seems like we're at a bit of an impasse. Right? Okay, so maybe there's some reason to be hopeful. Right, so maybe a choice of voting rule is not a matter of real significance because voting methods tend to select the same alternative. Distinct voting methods tend to select the same alternative. Right? And so this is something that two mathematicians, Gerlin and Lepley, have pointed out and discussed. And I actually think it's been noted by others before them. So the idea is that voting methods actually do converge on the same candidate. But this actually happens only if there's a certain level of homogeneity in the community. So that is, voters all need to have similar or very similar preference orderings to one another. Right? And so it is only in a rather special case where we end up getting this convergence. It's only in a special case where the choice of voting method isn't of much consequence. Right? Okay, and so what I want to explore is a different kind of sort of convergence argument, if you will. And so instead of showing that voting rules converge and select the same candidate or alternative, I'm going to argue that different approaches within the broader welfarist tradition are going to endorse the same ordinal method of voting. Right? And in particular, it's going to be the Borda count. And so the claim is that welfarists of sort of all stripes and colors should take the Borda count to be more attractive than plurality rule, than ranked choice voting, and some of the other various alternatives that people have talked about. Okay. Right. Okay, so but first though, I want to quickly outline what I take to be the fundamental commitments of the welfarist. And so welfarism, very, very broad sort of ethical framework, sort of implicitly assumed by lots and lots of economists, political scientists, social scientists more generally. It is a contentious ethical framework, of course. So the bare bones description is this. So welfarism involves first some story or account of well-being or welfare. So you could think that this story in some way invokes capabilities or maybe opportunity sets if you're someone like Robert Sugden. More traditionally, you could think just about preference satisfaction or something along those lines. And so that's the first thing. Second, we need a rule for ranking vectors of well-being numbers. So we need some way to sort of compare. And final observation is that when we go to rank these well-being vectors, we only attend to the well-being pattern. So that is, we just look at the distribution. We don't consider what process led to this distribution, whether that process involved coercion or domination or something other, some other sort of unsavory thing. Right. Okay, so that's sort of welfarism, a quick run through it. And so the natural question is, well, if we buy into this framework, we need to then specify how we go about ranking outcomes, how we go about ranking these utility vectors. Right. So when is utility vector U superior to utility vector V? Right? And so one natural response is to just attend to the sum of utilities. So U is superior to V if the sum of utilities in U is greater than the sum of utilities in V. And so this is the basic sort of utilitarian welfarist approach. And what I want to discuss really briefly are three alternative ways, non-utilitarian ways of ranking utility vectors. Right. Okay, so the first, probably most familiar to people, is the prioritarian approach. And so it's very similar to utilitarianism. We add utilities together, but utilities are subject to an increasing and concave function, call it G. And so to illustrate the difference between utilitarianism and prioritarianism, so to consider the case where we have two units of well-being, right? So not two resource units, but 2 units of well-being, and that we can allocate those 2 units to someone in the population. Right? So the utilitarian doesn't care whether we increase the well-off person's well-being or the not so well-off person's well-being. Right? both interventions are going to result in the same increase in overall well-being or welfare. The prioritarian, though, thinks that it's best to direct those 2 units of well-being toward the worse off person. Right? And so one way to try and make this concrete, and so I only bring this up because there is some technical bit later where this becomes a little bit important, right? But one way to try and pin this down is to introduce a particular function, a particular prioritarian function. And we're going to look at the so-called Atkinson social welfare function. The details aren't that important. Really what's nice about this Atkinson function is that we have this parameter P, and we can actually recover a number of canonical social welfare functions if we set P to a particular value. So if we set it to 0, we just get utilitarianism. If we set it to 1, we get the Nash social welfare function, where we consider the product of well-being. And then as P approaches infinity, we approach the Lexi-Min or the Rawlsian social welfare function, where we sort of maximize the welfare of the worst off member of the group. Okay, so that's prioritarianism. So another non-utilitarian approach is Sufficientarianism. And so in some sense, it's kind of a reaction to some of the limitations of prioritarianism, or some of the issues that people took with it. And so one criticism of prioritarianism is that it gives greater ethical weight to the well-being changes affecting worse off individuals, even if the worse off are themselves doing really, really well, right? So if you're at a fancy party in Beverly Hills, it seems weird or perverse to give priority to Warren Buffett if Jeff Bezos is in the room, right? Jeff Bezos, his net worth, I think, is billions more than Warren Buffett's, right? So the sort of Sufficientarian thinks that it's somewhat absurd for the rich to get to be given priority over the super rich, right? Priority just shouldn't be an issue once you get to a certain echelon of wealth or well-being. Okay. So anyway, but Sufficientarians, while they critique prioritarianism, they think there's something to the view, and they think that prioritarianism should be restricted to those below some well-being threshold. All right, so Roger Crisp develops one version of Sufficientarianism, which is kind of a blend of utilitarianism and prioritarianism. And the idea is that, well, morality is going to include some sort of well-being threshold, and that threshold is going to bifurcate the ethical significance of well-being changes. Okay, so just really, really quickly, one way of trying to operationalize all of this, right, is as this 2-step rule to compare utility vectors. So once we specify a suitable well-being threshold, right, so that's what this line is, we then in the first step consider only those below the threshold. So we're just considering these little red frowny guys. And then we compare U and V, vector U and V, by applying the prioritarian social welfare function to the below threshold vectors. Right? So if U has a higher score, we say that it is superior to V, and vice versa. And then it's only in the case of a tie, right, where everyone below the threshold is doing just as well as each other, that in the second stage, we then consider the above threshold vectors, and we compare the above threshold vectors with a sort of utilitarian calculation, right? So if U has more aggregate utility above the threshold, then it's preferred to V. Okay, so I know we're just running through all these really quickly, but the very last sort of welfarist that I want to talk about is the egalitarian. All right, so that's the last non-utilitarian approach I'm going to consider, and sometimes it's referred to as rank-weighted egalitarianism. And so the idea here is that, look, we're going to calculate the weighted average of individual utilities. So it sounds very similar to utilitarianism, but we're going to do so in a somewhat complicated fashion that sort of gets at the egalitarian intuitions here. So first, let's introduce this this vector of weights, W. And this vector is in decreasing order or descending order from largest to smallest. All right, so we have these weights. And then we're going to consider our utility vector U and V. And we're going to rearrange them in ascending order. So from worst off to best off. All right, and we're going to do the same thing for V. And then U, vector U, is said to be superior to V when the weighted average of U prime is greater than the weighted average of V prime using our vector of weights W. Right. Okay, so sorry if that was a bit of a whirlwind, but I just want to try and give you guys a sense of the sort of different positions and how they're all going to end up converging on the same voting method. Okay, so yeah, so just as a quick reminder of where we're headed, so we don't get too distracted by all that, we're going to show that all four of these sort of approaches end up endorsing the same voting method, namely the Borda count. Okay, so at this point, let's very briefly talk about the voting methods themselves. And so I'm going to consider a number of different voting mechanisms. All in all, we have 14 different methods. I'm not going to go through all of them, of course. I'm just going to focus on 3 that are particularly important for our purposes. Some of these are really intuitive that you probably have known and participated in before. Plurality rule, the Borda count, and something called anti-plurality rule. And so plurality rule is probably the most well-known method. So here we have 6 voters. They rank the 3 alternatives, X, Y, and W. And plurality rule just looks at this top row. Right? So the candidate who is in the top position the most number of times is then declared the winner. So in essence, all voters just vote for their favorite candidate, and then the candidate with the most number of votes wins. Right? So very intuitive. Anti-plurality rule is somewhat similar. Instead of voting for a candidate, though, we vote against a candidate. So once again, we only vote for one candidate, but we vote against a candidate, and the candidate with the least number of votes against it ends up winning. So in this case, X and W both secure 3 votes, and Y secures no votes, and so Y is the winner. Right? No one has voted against Y. Okay. And so finally, the Borda count is probably the most complicated of these methods, and it involves a point system. So each candidate secures some number of points from each voter, and the exact number depends on where they are in the voters' ranking. So if you are a candidate and you're in the top position, you get 3 points from that voter. If you are in the middle position, you get 2 points from that voter. And if you're in the bottom position, you only get 1 point from that voter. And then we just sum across all voters to get the total point count. And the candidate with the most number of points ends up winning. All right, so a real quick example. So we can calculate the total number of points for alternative X. So Alf, Betty, and Frank place X at the very top of their ranking. And so X secures 3 points from each of these voters. Charlie, Danny, and Emma place X at the very bottom. And so X gets 1 point from each of these individuals. And so you have a combined total of 12 points. Candidate Y, I didn't do the calculation here, but they actually win. They get a total of 14 points. So candidate Y wins under the Borda count. Okay, so we have these 14 methods, and we want to compare them. Right? But how do we go about doing that? Well, we need to have a community of voters, right? And we saw in the previous slides that the Borda count and plurality rule don't always yield the same winner for Alf and his friends. Right? So, but where did Alf's preferences come from? Well, we can generate these preferences using some sampling method and some computers. And this is what I do in the paper. But what I also do in the paper is, and what I want to focus on now, is where we actually go out and get real world data and then run these elections using this data. Okay. Okay, so this brings us to the American National Election Survey. So the ANES is this really gigantic data set. So it's not just about preferences about voting. It's also about economic insecurity, racial attitudes, all sorts of things. And it's collected and maintained by these researchers at the University of Michigan. And they conduct these surveys during every presidential election year. And they've been doing it now for, I think, like 3 or 4 decades, right? And so I'm just going to look at the past 12 election years, not including the most recent election, of course. And overall, there are 30,000 participants across these 12 years. And one thing that the researchers ask the participants is to evaluate a number of nationally known politicians on a 100-point scale, right? So where do you place Bernie Sanders? What number do you assign to Donald Trump, right, et cetera? So in other words, we can get an ordinal preference ranking from the ANES survey data, right? And so that's where we can get Alf's preferences from and Alf's friends' preferences. And then what we can do is we can use this data to then run a number of what's sometimes referred to as synthetic elections, right? So if we just think of the 2016 presidential year, sorry, this talk is so American-centric, but participants ranked Bernie Sanders like Trump and the Green Party candidate Jill Stein, right? Now, Bernie Sanders, Trump, and Jill Stein actually never were in an election together, but we could, now that we have preferences for all the individuals, we could actually run such an election involving these presidential contenders using this survey data. And there were enough politicians in the ANES data set for us to run over 3,000 distinct synthetic elections. Right? Okay. So the last thing, though, is that there's something missing. And so we need more than just ordinal utility for our purposes, right? So we want to determine whether prioritarians like the Borda count, and we need to convert, to do that, we need to convert the ordinal utility function into a cardinal utility function. And there's sort of two ways of doing this. So the first is that, well, the researchers from Michigan, the people who organized and gathered this material, they just asked participants to rank politicians on a 100-point sort of thermometer, as they called it. And so we could use the thermometer score as a kind of proxy for their cardinal utility, sort of a rough and ready way of getting interpersonally comparable utility. Right? Now, alternatively, we don't have to rely on the thermometer scores. Instead, we can just sort of assign utility scores on the basis of draws, independent draws from some distribution. Right. And so this is actually, I do both of these in the paper. I'm just going to talk about this latter method now. And this is actually how a number of papers in this literature proceed. And so in particular, let's just look at the uniform distribution, maybe something like the beta distribution, something that's contained on the unit interval. You know, once we have one for each voter, assign specific numbers to each candidate, we can then determine which candidate maximizes the sum of utilities or maximizes the prioritarian social welfare function. Right. Okay, so finally, to the climax, to the results section. I think I might need maybe another 5 or 10 minutes. Sorry for going a little over. Okay, so we have over 3,000 synthetic elections from the survey data. We have 14 different voting methods, and we have 4 different sort of welfarist approaches: utilitarian, prioritarian, egalitarian, and sufficientarian. And what we're interested in is how a particular voting method, the Borda count, plurality rule, anti-plurality rule, whether or not they select a candidate that maximizes, say, the utilitarian social function, welfare function, or how often a particular voting method selects a candidate that maximizes the prioritarian social welfare function or the egalitarian social welfare function, right? And we refer to this as the efficiency score. So that's what we have here on the X and Y axis. So if the utilitarian efficiency score for plurality rule is 0.8, then what that means is that 80% of our synthetic elections using the winner under plurality rule is the utilitarian candidate. That is the candidate that maximizes the sum of utilities. Right? Okay, so that's the sort of metric that we're going to use. And that's what we track on the y-axis here, the utilitarian efficiency score. And then on the x-axis, we have the prioritarian efficiency score. And it's a bit difficult to see. And so we're going to take a close-up look at this figure in the next slide. So don't worry if you can't make out everything. But here are some preliminary results, at least. So some observations. So note that the Borda count secures the highest utilitarian efficiency score, but also the highest prioritarian efficiency score. So it's the most likely voting method out of all the voting methods to pick the candidate that the prioritarian thinks is best. Right? It does best on both counts. Right? Anti-plurality rule, however, in the lower left corner, it performs really badly. It does worse on both counts. And furthermore, plurality rule does pretty horrendously as well, which actually isn't too surprising for anyone who has waded and read up in this literature a little bit. So plurality rule does worse than 12 of the other voting methods with respect to both utilitarian and prioritarian efficiency. Okay, so here's a close-up of the figure. So one thing to note is that this method HARE, which is closely related to ranked choice voting, only does a tad bit better than plurality rule. And in the US, at least, there's this push to adopt ranked choice voting. I think, I haven't reflected on it too much, but that seems like a sensible thing to do. But it's just worth pointing out, though, that even though I think it will be an improvement over the status quo, which would plurality rule, notice that there are many other voting methods that would fare even better than ranked choice voting, better than HARE. Okay, so that was prioritarianism, right? So now let's look at egalitarianism and sufficientarianism. And once again, the y-axis showcases the utilitarian efficiency score. And in the top figure, the x-axis corresponds to the egalitarian efficiency score, which is a measure of how often a particular voting method selects the candidate that the egalitarian thinks is the best candidate on the ballot, right? And then in the bottom figure, the x-axis is the sufficientarian efficiency score, a measure of how often the voting method selects the candidate that maximizes the sufficientarian social welfare function. Okay, so both pictures, in both pictures, we get they're strikingly similar to the one we saw on the previous slide. Right? The Borda has the highest egalitarian as well as sufficientarian efficiency score. Plurality rule still lags behind. One thing of note is that anti-plurality rule does significantly better, actually. So in fact, it has the second highest sufficientarian efficiency score. So in the very bottom, we can see that anti-plurality rule does actually almost as good as Borda. And actually, this is not a fluke. And so anti-plurality rule actually outperforms Borda in certain cases. Right? So once again, anti-plurality is where we vote against a particular candidate, and the candidate with the least votes against it wins. Right? So here we are once again considering the prioritarian efficiency score on the y-axis, and the x-axis is this parameter p. Right? And so this is a parameter that I introduced really, really briefly when we're talking about the Atkinson social welfare function. And it essentially determines how much priority we give to welfare changes of the worse off. Right? And so if p is 0, then no priority is given to such welfare changes, and we get utilitarianism. And as p goes to infinity, we recover something kind of like the difference principle, and our focus is almost exclusively on the welfare of the worst off individual. And so note that as p increases, right? So that is as we increasingly give more priority to welfare changes of the worst off, the winner under anti-plurality rule is more likely to be the candidate that maximizes the prioritarian social welfare function. And eventually, anti-plurality rule secures a higher efficiency score than even the Borda counter. Right, so some prioritarians may prefer to use anti-plurality rule to determine the winner of an election. Right. Okay, we get a very similar picture. A very similar picture emerges when we look at rank-weighted egalitarianism. So the rank-weighted efficiency score is on the y-axis now, and on the x-axis is a measure of the weight we give to those in the low end of the distribution. And so the larger the value of the parameter rho, it's really hard to see, I'm sorry. So the more weight we place on the utility of the worse off. And once again, Borda does best up to a point, and then anti-plurality rule eventually overtakes Borda. Okay, so I know that was sort of a fire hose, a lot of information, right? So I just want to try and sum up really briefly, and then I really appreciate any comments or questions or just general reactions. Okay, so we began with this question of how should we collectively decide, right? And we've outlined and explored a novel approach to this question. So we consider which ordinal voting method welfarists of all stripes will endorse, will find favorable. And surprisingly, we found that welfarists can agree, generally speaking, on a method, and that method is the Borda counter. Right? And so to support this claim, we drew on some real-world data to compare our 14 voting methods, and we've seen that the Borda count is the preferred method, not just for the utilitarian, but also for the 3 non-utilitarian approaches. I didn't mention this, but in the paper, at least, try to show that the result is somewhat robust. So there are qualitatively similar conclusions if we use the thermometer data, if we instead don't even use survey data, instead just sort of generate ordinal rankings from sampling, some sampling process, we can also get a similar result. So this is something I know I look into in the paper, but I don't really discuss in the talk. Okay, so finally, though, some qualifications are needed. So we've seen that anti-plurality rule, in certain settings at least, secures a really high efficiency score, a higher efficiency score than the Borda count. And anti-plurality rule does well when the social welfare function is highly attentive to the bottom end of the distribution. Right? And so this is in some sense actually not too surprising. So anti-plurality rule, once again, is a rule where we vote against a candidate and the candidate with the least votes against it wins. And so anti-plurality rule has a tendency to select what are sometimes referred to as sort of compromise candidates, right? So that is sort of nondescript or inoffensive candidates that no one particularly likes, no one's too enthusiastic about, but also no one hates, right? So polarizing candidates, on the other hand, so those are the candidates that some people really are in favor of, and some people detest. Those polarizing candidates are actually going to do really poorly under anti-plurality rule. Too many people are going to vote against them, right? And so for this reason, sort of extreme forms of prioritarianism and egalitarianism are actually going to favor anti-plurality rule. They pick the candidate that ensures that everyone, right, does sort of okay, right, is content. Okay, now I just want to drop this in here. Maybe we can talk about it more if people are interested in this. But there's some experimental work trying to pin down individuals' distributional preferences, right? So the preferences they have over different distributions in society. And I can, I tentatively think, at least, that the empirical work shows that individuals do have some prioritarian inclinations, but they are sort of moderate prioritarians. So that is, they don't put too much priority on well-being changes to the worse off. And sort of a more moderate prioritarian is going to find the Borda count more appealing than the anti-plurality rule, right? And so I think there's some reason to think that pretty much even the prioritarian and egalitarian welfarist is going to find the Borda count preferable to anti-plurality rule. Okay, well, thanks for your attention. And yeah, I'm happy to take any questions you guys have or just comments.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, we're open for questions.